And I had the good fortune of bringing Mary Evelyn and John to Yale when I was the dean there. It was a true blessing for me and for Yale. They have joint appointments in the Environment School at Yale and the Divinity School. Fairly, I think, unique arrangement. Mary Evelyn is the author and editor of many additional books, including Worldly Wonder, Religions Enter Their Ecological Phase, of which you have an excerpt or a summary in E-Magazine, which has been distributed. She's the recipient of many awards and honors and recognitions, which now, fascinating to behold, one of those awards is an Emmy Award for the very influential and moving and informative documentary Journey of the Universe, which if you haven't seen, I would strongly encourage you to access and have a chance to see it. And one of these days we might show it here in Stratford. Mary Evelyn is just a warm and very wonderful person and a dear friend, and it's been a great privilege to get to know her, and it's a great honor to have this opportunity to introduce her. Mary Evelyn.
Well, to be introduced by Gus and Cameron, who's these are two of the most wonderful people, as you know, in the environmental world. But everywhere we go, whether it's Asia or Europe, everyone says, say hello to Gus and Cameron, because he's been so influential in these very, very important areas around the world. But I really want to come back, as so many of you have, to say thank you to Jeff Wolf, to Byron Breeze, and to Greg Wilson and their committee and the volunteers and so many of you who have really pulled this together. It seems to be,
You all right?
if we can pull it down a little bit, can we do that? It seems as though these kinds of local, a little more, yeah, great, thank you. It seems as though these kinds of local events are what are really going to transform us over time. And before we go into, I think, what I want to say, I also want to just give a shout out to Nancy Wright from Burlington, Lutheran leader for all the Lutheran churches in New England on the environment. Pat Seaman, who's here, started a Earth Law Center. Many of the speakers are both friends and colleagues. I don't know if Steve Blackmer's here yet. And Larry Parks and Sharon Delos and Parks, Sharon and Larry, who are here. But let me also just echo what John said, what Gus said about John Grimm. Because John Grimm, whose specialty is indigenous traditions around the world, and particularly Native American traditions, is one of the reasons why this field and this film have been able to come out. So I want to, as always, dedicate this talk to John, our families, and our friends. So I loved this morning's session because I was trying to think, what could become between me and your cookies and your dessert and so on, and the chatting that you're having? And I said, well, the only thing I can think that might be interesting is telling my story, which I very rarely do, because I live in this very uptight academia, and you don't tell your story. And as Cindy says, you do not say anything about your spirituality. Oh my God, it's just too awful. So, you know, I'm getting a little bit loose now when I'm outside of Yale. And I'm quite serious about that. You know, you just don't go there. And that's probably why we're in some of the trouble we're in, okay?
Yeah.
So I thought in that spirit, how did I get into this? So like many of you, I'm a 60s person. So social justice was huge for me, and civil rights. I'm a New Yorker. Harlem, I just couldn't get the disparities. It was just really awful for me. Born up on the Upper West Side near Columbia and so on. So this bothered me hugely. Then I went to college in Washington, D.C., where Nancy Pelosi went, Trinity College, where Kathleen Sebelius went. Huge social justice activism and so on. But in particular, it was the civil rights movement that was just exploding in Washington, and Martin Luther King and all these leaders were there. So that was a very, very important part of our college years, in addition to the anti-Vietnam War protests. How many of you are 60s people? Exactly, look at this. Come on, see, we have this energy here, right? And some of you are retired or retiring. This is the new movement. This is the new time. I really mean it. I really mean it. So, social justice, the dignity of the human, equity, the sense of opportunity. But then the second big movement for our generation was peace. How can we create the conditions for peace? And how could we bear to see our friends, our family, our cousins going off to Vietnam and so on? This was wrong. This was wrong. I mean, 400,000 troops in Vietnam, it's hard to conceive. 50,000 people killed there. The Vietnam War Memorial. I think it was fine. What do I know? A microphone as tall as me makes me a little nervous. Okay, so what I want to integrate, though, into this Vietnam piece is I went off to Japan very disillusioned after Nixon came into office. And I said, I'm not coming back till he gets out of office. And I was teaching in a college there and so on for 2 years. And I come out on the subway station in Tokyo, and it says, Nixon resigns. I was like, oh, I can go home now. And I had been in a Zen retreat. And I said, well, maybe some of that energy that was talked about this morning has effect. But I went on a trip all through Asia, and it was a time when you could do just amazing things, and it was very, very cheap to do it. And I went to Vietnam, actually, in the fall of '74. And although we had a peace treaty earlier in that year, there were still troops there. And you flew over Vietnam, and Agent Orange was visible in the destruction of the forests. I went into an orphanage. The effects of the war were just so poignant, so horrendous. And literally a few months later was when the Saigon fell. And you remember those pictures of off the embassy and so on, and throwing the helicopters, $250,000 helicopters, into the water for the rescue and so on. I mean, those are wrenching images, aren't they? So what are the conditions for peace that are important for our third major movement of my life, and I'm sure yours as well? And that is the environment. So I saw the effects, I began to see the effects of what was happening in Asia, just starting with Vietnam. But in the early 70s, you could move through these cities, Jakarta and Delhi and Taipei and so on, not necessarily with ease, but you could move through them as you cannot now. So we are talking about 40 years later. What those of us who began to study Asia understood, this was going to be an explosion that would change the face of the planet. Namely, India and China, 2 billion plus people, wanting a car, a refrigerator, air conditioning. If you read Edward Wong just 2 weeks ago in the New York Times, you know what is happening. And those of us in Asian studies, as I came back from Asia, I went to Columbia and so on, we were terrified as we anticipated what was going to happen. I'm a scholar of Japan, and so I know what industrialization has meant there, and China as well is my area of study. So in 40 years, we have some of the most ferocious environmental problems ever seen on the planet. So the question was, what would an environmental ethics look like that would be attentive to the cultural diversity around our planet? What's it going to look like in India? It's not going to look like Christianity and Judaism. It's going to look like Hinduism and Jainism and Buddhism, and the same for China. It's going to have a Confucian flavor, it's going to have a Taoist flavor and a Buddhist flavor, and indigenous traditions all over the world rising up now in tremendous protests over what's happening to their lands and their cultures. So this sense that we have to be attentive to this cultural diversity led us to do those Harvard conferences with hundreds of people around the planet. It was in the mid-90s and before 9/11, and people could travel, get visas without the same kinds of difficulties and so on. But there was such energy about this because when Gus brought us to Yale, I mean, he was one of the people saying, as almost no one could say, well, we've got, and at Harvard we kept saying, we've got to work with the other disciplines. We have to work, we called it SEEP, science, education, economics, and policy. And so we need the scientific facts. We've got to have education into this. We have to have a new economics, and we've got to have policy that functions beyond these treaties. But of course, by the time we got to Yale, Gus said, well, science and policy aren't working anymore. We need religion, spirituality, ethics, the arts, what many of you are working on here as well. I mean, he had said even the law, it's not going to do it fully, even though he founded NRDC, founded a policy institute, World Resources Institute. So we were like, oh, maybe the time is ripe for this new infusion of what was talked about on the panel in great richness, and what Bill McKibben has been working on. In other words, we have the scientific facts and policy papers. We have emerging, fortunately, and again thanks to Gus, a new economics institute, a new ecological economics, and Juliet Shore and many other people are working on this, Bob Costanza and Richard Norgaard and so on. But what do we need? And I think this is something we all intuit, and Gus even referred to it last night. So I've mentioned social justice, I've mentioned the peace movement, and I've mentioned environmentalism. We need to bring them together. We need to integrate these tremendous movements which have been so central to many sectors of our culture, our society, and that includes in the religions, in the environmental movement, in the peace movement. You see, these are all different streams. We have a friend who's a nun who's now in a prison in Georgia because she's been working for 30 years against the military-industrial complex. And she did an action in Oak Ridge and against this huge trillion-dollar budget and so on. This is a peace movement that's been under the radar screen by and large, but that movement and the justice and the economic movement and the environmental movement have got to come together for this large-scale transformation. Because climate change, as we heard this morning, is a reflection of these movements, food being so central to these issues. I've been vegetarian for 30 years, and I think the local food movement, the organic food movement, and so on is essential. But here's what we have to do in addition to bringing them together. We have to reformulate what Cindy was talking about, the worldviews and the values, right? That's what John and I have been trying to work through. What are the worldviews and values that shape us, even unconsciously? And again, Gus has done this magnificently in the book, New Manifesto for America, America the Possible. This sense, how do we deconstruct? If we begin with justice, we've got to put in the social and economic justice. We've got to reconfigure, as many people said, Cindy in particular, capitalism as an octopus, which is sucking up the resources of the planet. Because we have, again said this morning, we have this myth of progress, this myth of economic growth. I see the heads are nodding. It's well known now. Again, pronounced in Gus's book. A myth of progress, you see, is driving our action. This is the heart of America. a progress myth, but it's a progress that's becoming a dystopia instead of a utopia, you see? And we don't even understand what's driving it, what's the story behind it, bigger and better and so on, and that markets will solve everything. Again, Cindy's critique. I had this written down, but Cindy, good work. No, that we're going to solve it by carbon exchange markets or even carbon tax. This is something beyond market mentalities, isn't it? It's beyond market mentality. It's not to say that can't be part of the equations, but why is this so problematic? Because it identifies us fundamentally as Homo economicus. Homo economicus, right? Homo consumerist to the max. And we can sense this pushback, this almost nausea. Remember when Sartre and Camus were talking, there's a book, Nausea, right? This is becoming nauseous. I get nauseous when I go to the mall. I have mallophobia. You know, it's something we know we're up against a certain limit, don't we? So, and also Homo economicus leads us to this next point. It leads to conflict, right? And if we're talking about peace, how are we going to recreate the conditions for peace, the foundations of a peaceful society, if we identify ourselves as consumerists, as Homo economicus, and so on? Thomas Berry, our teacher, used to say, there's no peace until there's peace with the earth. There's peace with the earth. And this is what I saw, of course, in Vietnam. If you think of the largest environmental destructions around the planet, it's due to wars and their consequences, and the various military sites even in our own country, which are going to take centuries to deal with, to clean up, and so on. And fundamentally, at the bottom of this is the resource wars which are already present. What is Iraq? It's an oil war. It is an oil war. And if we think the wars on oil bases are intense, destructive, look at the consequences for families, for the crippling effects on humans, what are the water wars going to look like? What are they going to? They are here. Absolutely, they are here. We know that. We absolutely know it. What are the conditions for peace? If we don't sort out what's going to happen to the Oglala Aquifer, the Hudson River, the Colorado River, the Columbia River, the de-damming movement, there's so many things we need to do to reclaim the rights of rivers, which New Zealand has just done recently, right? The rights of rivers, and it's why this wild law sensibility about the profound natural resources that we have. That brings me to the third point. Reconfiguring. Is nature simply a resource? Or is nature the source of life? Is nature the source of our life, which gets to what Byron and others are trying to evoke? We don't have the language to describe this fully, you see, and that's part of our problem. It's a source of life on which we all depend. It weaves us together. It gives us our food, our water, our air, our sustenance. The other worldview shift we know we have to make, nature is not mechanistic. It's not a mechanism that we can just kind of tweak and geoengineer or technologize. Nature is organic, holistic. That's how ecology began, with a tremendous sense of the intricacy and interdependency of these ecosystems. We think we can manage these. We barely understand them. There was an effort to restore coral reefs off the coast of Florida. They put in tires, thinking that tires were going to regroup these living systems. It's incredible. Seeding the oceans, all of the geoengineering schemes that are coming up. Clive Hamilton has a book on this, Gus was just telling us. We have to be very wary of our manipulative mentality, which comes from seeing nature as mechanism. Nature as dominated and controlled, and we can say over and over again the passage from Genesis of dominion and so on, and theologians are reclaiming that, for a sense of care for creation and so on. But it's not just Genesis that said we have a dominating mentality. We have had this for a long, long time. Control and domination. And Shyla mentioned something last night that I think is at the heart of our problem. And that is, we have lost this sense of reverence. We have lost our sense of what it means. Schweitzer had it, reverence for life. The sacredness of all of this living system that's around, the livingness of the earth community. So, bringing back then, I think, awe, wonder, beauty. Did you notice when Bill spoke last night about beauty at the end, you could hear a pin drop? It was incredible. And that's why those of you who are artists and musicians, and whether you go to church or not, this spiritual sensibility of the beauty and complexity of the world is what draws us forward. Absolutely incontrovertible. And I like to say to my science colleagues, it draws you forward too. If you're understanding ecosystems, bird movements, migrations of birds, the best bird watchers say we haven't got a clue as to these incredible thousands and thousands of miles, right? The red-knot sandpiper comes from Tierra del Fuego at the bottom of South America, goes to the Delaware Chesapeake Bay area, eats the horseshoe crab eggs from 300 million year old horseshoe crabs, right? Flies to James Bay, summers, has their young, and here's the miracle, the young fly back to the Chesapeake Bay and to Tierra del Fuego before their parents. There's something there of the migrating, imprinting pattern. Isn't that astounding? Astounding. And we think we know how to control these? Caribou migrations, turtle migrations. You get the picture? But if we can evoke what every child knows, and it's why summer is such a magical season for a child, who can be outdoors, who can be in the presence of this great mystery that we call the natural world. There's hope for restoration, I think, of our energy. We're in a period where we say we're looking for new sources of energy, right? Renewable energy. Why is this conference so important? Because the most renewable energy of the human is the spirit. It's eternally renewable. Why do we give to the next generation? Why do they inspire us? Why do our students at Yale get us so excited? I have goosebumps right now thinking about them. Why do the Vermont law students inspire us? The next generation gives us that spirit of hope and possibility. I said to this young woman, Margaret, I don't know if she's here today, but I said to her last night, what gives you hope? She's a senior in high school. She said, I'm teaching young people this summer outdoors. She's inspired. That's the intergenerational dimension of this. So let me kind of conclude here by saying, I think there's immense hope in the work certainly being done here in this tremendous state of Vermont and across New England and across the US and so on. And it's a hope from this new integration, isn't it, of ecology, of justice, and of peace. And I want to say that the Earth Charter, which, how many of you know of the Earth Charter? Great, because it's been used in town meetings here in Vermont. But here's the interesting thing about the Earth Charter in terms of these integrating principles. The World Council of Churches had this notion of peace, justice, and integrity of creation. Okay, or justice, peace, and integrity of creation. The Earth Charter shifted it to prioritize ecological integrity. If the Earth's systems go down, everything goes down. So an economic system and justice system has to fit within the ecosystem. So ecological integrity, social economic justice, democracy, nonviolence, and peace. We need the democratic institutions to make this function. But the other edition of the Earth Charter, which I was so very honored to be part of that formation of the writing with Stephen Rockefeller, who was up at Middlebury College for many, many years, is the context. And this is the note I want to end on, because it's a note of a symphony. It's really a note that everyone has a part, whether it's a vocal part, a musical part, the technological help part, whatever it is. The symphony is this, and the preface, the prelude to the Earth Charter is we're part of a vast, evolving universe. Part of a vast, evolving universe. Just like Greg said, how old are you? 13.7 billion years old, plus 58. I loved it. That vast, evolving universe is what Thomas Berry offered over many, many years. At age 60, he came to this notion that we need a new story that will inspire the work on the ground, the transformations. And so I like to think of it as the inspiration for the perspiration, the great story for the great work that we're all doing. Who doesn't want to be involved in a great work? It's why we dedicate ourselves to our students and our children and our grandchildren. The great work is now, and it is emerging. And here's the final story that comes back a bit to my own story, but to your story and your children's story. In 2 generations, here's what's emerged in terms of the consciousness of the human, that we belong to this vast, evolving universe, and that the other part of it in the Charter is Earth is alive with a myriad community of life. So, it's not just an abstract idea. My grandfather taught European history at Columbia. He was a lovely man from upstate New York, very, very simple, but totally dedicated to the future. He came down to Columbia, which was a very American history department, as many departments still are. He said, you know what? We need to know our European history too. So he did many textbooks on European history and so on and so forth. And in the Second World War, he was ambassador to Spain to keep, under Roosevelt, to keep Spain neutral. He had this whole thing of nationalism. He helped found that field, nationalism as a religion, that the nation state was the cause of the 2 world wars. His student, Ted DeBerry, went into, don't you love this term, the Asian theater of war, the Pacific part of the war. He and many other colleagues learned Japanese and Chinese, and they began to study these traditions of Asia and respected them. They came back and set up at Columbia and Yale and Harvard and across the country the best Asian studies programs in the world. And for the first time, we understood these are 5,000-year-old cultures. China, incredible civilization, right? Incredible literature, history, religion, politics. The next phase of that was I became Ted DeBerry's student. So my grandfather, European history, Asian history, and I was a student of Asian history, and along with Thomas Berry, a student of the world's religions. We came out of Columbia kind of in another world, trying to find our way into this world. What was emerging? World history. Now your children are taking world history in high school even, okay? And the genius of these folks were they worked with the high school teachers and the college teachers to say, we're not just Americans, we're not just Europeans, we're part of this global whole. We're global citizens. And the Africanists and the Latin Americanists and the Asianists dug in and did incredible work. You know what's happening now? This is just 2 generations. How many of you have heard of big history? Google big history, right? It's quite amazing. The historians are saying, well, world history even isn't enough. We are part of the Earth community. 4.6 billion years old. How amazing is that? 1 billion years just for the first cell to emerge. How astounding is that? You see the energy we can draw on for transformation with this understanding? They've got 7 areas of transformation, and the students are like that. That is so cool. I understand my lineage. I understand my ancestry. And then they take it to universe history. You see, so it's universe, Earth, and human history, this big history movement. Bill Gates is supporting it. It's moving, folks. And also from science, an epic of evolution, Eric Chasen and E.O. Wilson. Eric Chasen's been teaching this for 25 years. And our offering into this is Journey of the Universe, which brings together science and history. You see, with a sense of the poetics, the metaphors, the literary images that can image us into this grand narrative of which we participate. So the invitation is, how can we participate in this epic of evolution? How can we find our place in the journey of the universe? How can we bring our communities, our churches, our synagogues, our town halls into this discussion? We can do it. We're doing it right now. And thank you very much for your great work. Thank you. Few questions. While you're thinking, Nancy Wright wanted me to mention that up at Shelburne Farms, there's going to be an oratorio on Journey of the Universe, September 15th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're...
Don't miss it.
It's free, open to the public, beautiful music, art, and so on. A question? Yes.
Having looked at all the 10 great faith traditions, would you care to give us a sense of which were the easiest or easier to make the bridge from the canon to the environment?
Yeah.
And which were the most difficult or intractable? Now, you may want to duck that question.
Duck? No, I'll just jump into it. No, I usually do try and duck it because, I mean, you know, my area of study is Asian religions, in part because I felt in Japan there a tremendous sense, despite its rapid industrial, and 73, 74 was like being at the end of the Meiji era still. There was very few foreigners. It was incredible. You could walk around Kyoto and those are buildings, and a city that's 1,000, the buildings aren't, but the city is 1,000 years old. Now, these traditions of Shinto, Buddhism, Confucianism have a tremendous sensibility about nature, the natural world. It's remarkable, very powerful. It's not to say they were always used, you see, with industrialization, because they were trying to imitate the West. So the Asian traditions have something huge to offer. John and I are going in September to a conference that's bringing these together for China. And the books, the Harvard book volumes on Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism have been translated back into Chinese. John's area of indigenous traditions, everybody always refers to indigenous traditions as close to the earth, which they are, not that they haven't made mistakes. But you know, we dump on the Western religions a lot, and we're like, we're recovering from Western civilization and so on. But you know what? The thickest book, besides indigenous, is up there on the table, and it's Christianity. It was a huge conference. And we were in Iran in 2001, before 9/11 in 2005, for a conference that Hatami had on Islam and the environment, the past president of, and people from the Arab world, because they have this sense of trusteeship. And Hatami and the Minister for the Environment son said, the environment to us is our most critical problem. So it's a desert community, you know? And so Judaism clearly has a covenantal sense to offer. Christianity has a sacramental sense to offer. All kinds of sensibilities here, which we could get into details, but there's going to be a homework assignment to read all of those volumes. John and I have the primer coming out in October from Island Press, Ecology and Religion, so you can maybe take a peek at that. And hopefully we're going to teach some online courses maybe on this too in the future. But the short answer is, honestly, Gus, all of the traditions have something to offer. And in Israel right now, there's a magnificent movement bringing the three Abrahamic traditions together to save the Jordan River. That's the other potential here, to bring religions together on specific environmental issues. Was that diplomatic, I hope? Yes, Pat.
Great, Ellen, thank you. And I was struck today with Bill's comment to all of us that talked about not only being engaged, but also not to hide our religious identities.
Yeah.
And I'd just like your further comment on that. Because for those, I'm a Catholic sister, and I said, I haven't worn a veil for 40 years, but maybe this would motivate me.
Well, and you know, the nuns across this country really got Thomas Berry, Brian Swim, who wrote the Universe story, and they've picked up a stupendous environmental sensibility and this wonderful work on earth jurisprudence that Pat is doing. So, okay, you know, we're being honest here. Gus is asking me, Pat's, I mean, I come out of a liberal Catholic social justice tradition. Dorothy Day, you know, civil rights. It was all that kind of a tradition. And gosh, this church has so many problems. But you know what? Maybe this Pope Francis, if he did an encyclical, you know, a big letter to 1.2 billion people who happen to be Catholic on the environment and climate change, and I was at the Vatican's first conference on climate change and said, please do this. And we're really pushing for this. Change will come from all kinds of places, right? Even though the Catholic Church is so off on so many, many issues. And Bartholomew, that Bill mentioned, you know, ecological sin. We went on his symposium that was just incredible. So here's my view, though. I mean, in academia, I would never say any of this, right? And we're at a school that Aldo Leopold went to. And the land ethic and his tremendous sense that what he was trying to say is the community of land is it's a biotic community. It's soil, it's air, it's water. You see, the extension of ethics to the land and now to the earth community is what we're about. We can come at this from many different angles. An ethical, environmental, social justice angle, a spiritual, moral angle. Within the religious traditions, all hands on deck, you know? And so, all hands on deck. Maybe last question? Is this it?
Sure, one last question.
Did you have it? Okay.
Question has to do with communications and conveying knowledge. I think that in the Bible it's very clear there are 2 or 3 places with statements such as, I will not have you ignorant. With your get understanding. I think it's Bear, whose book addresses the fact that the power brokers in our country are very clear about controlling media with respect to what the facts are and what challenges are. There are other places, you know, going back in our own history. Black codes, for example, post-Civil War. It was against the law to teach an African American to read and write. You were in jail, and in some instances you were killed. Women, our colleges and universities, from the Ivy Leagues on down, were anti-education for women, etc. Now my question is, what are some of the current obstacles or disagreements to sharing the kind of knowledge that you're sharing right now? In the academic setting, it's commonly known. But when we come from the campus to the community, the grassroots, then that totally is a different story. So what are some of those challenges? And secondly, what are some of the resources? You know, how do the solutions, how do we begin to convey? If you look at the setting here, and I'll set up, if we look at the setting here, we weren't publicized on CNN, ABC, and what's his name, Murdoch's TV station. But we are here, and the word can get out with respect to making a change, and in terms of not having people ignorant.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think about it often, and it's why I like to think of ourselves as a barnacle on a big ship at Yale, Forestry.
Repeat.
Oh, okay, the question was, what are the obstacles to how we come together, and what's the media communications piece? That's a simplification of more sophisticated questions. But I do think the obstacles, as I heard you, and this I would have put more about this into my talk, the obstacle, let me just talk about one obstacle, and that is that the earth, that's why I went through the earth is mechanistic, the earth is resource. You see, the earth is not a sacred community. The earth is not organic and holistic. And that is what I would suggest. Those of you who are scientists here, I don't mean to offend you, but a certain branch of science is reductionistic, mechanistic, will have nothing to do with this much more holistic and organic understanding of science. So, I mean, there's elements that are emergence and process and so on that are counterpoints to that. But by and large, the resistance of science to this kind of a discussion is huge, is embedded, and the other part of it is, which is why we did the film, The Journey of the Universe, is this incontrovertibly, in major scientific circles, this is a meaningless and purposeless universe. Have a good day. It's kind of like, you see, it's the random by chance. This is Stephen Jay Gould, and he was like, oh, I'm fine. You know, it's a random universe and cool things have happened, but there's no purpose. You use the word teleology, which is a sense of purpose, and you are out of the room. I mean, I said to two friends at Yale just recently, two incredibly respected scientists who actually like our work and like Journey of the Universe. And I just said, well, maybe something like Journey of the Universe can give people a sense that there's meaning. And they were like, there's no meaning in evolution. Everything is what we give it. You see, now there's an element of that's the social construction of knowledge kind of stuff. But if we don't live within a dynamic process, changing, exciting, differentiated, yes, by chance and necessity universe, I don't know what we live in. And you see, that sense of undermining meaning for the next generation, I think is the most insidious consequence of this kind of education. And we have not integrated it, which is why Journey of the Universe is trying to integrate science with a sense of meaning. It's not trying to announce it or pronounce it, but it's trying to evoke. There's something here that's awe-inspiring, mysterious, and wonderful. We communicate it through film, dance, music, and so on. But we've got to break this dualism down, because it's hugely destructive, that we live in a meaningless universe, and that's our challenge. That is really our challenge. But I think we can do it. I just want to signal David Grant is sitting there in the back, and we're beginning a series of high school teachers workshops at Lawrenceville, and he's participating in a science and humanities component coming together from schools all across the country. This will go on for 3 years. How do you teach Journey of the Universe? You see, bringing this together in a more robust and integrated way. I'm very excited about it. So thank you, David, for being part of it. Thank you all for listening with your cookies still in abeyance. Thank you so much.